Well, hi again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football, and this is Take 5 with Steven Travers. And Steven always brings a interesting guest, someone that would be either folklore that he grew up with, a guy that he played ball with, and someone that had moved on. And in many respects, that's one of the unique things about this show is that the togetherness of the camaraderie and the relationship that Steven has with most every guest that we have is very genuine. It's real. And it's worthwhile. And today is no different. Barry Kemp is our guest today, and Steven will introduce him in just a second. He's written, he is produced, he is directed Patch Adams, Catch Me If You Can, Romeo and Michelle's high school reunion. He's an Iowa guy, and I want to ask him, obviously, about some things that deal with the simplicity of Iowa and how he ends up being a part of Hollywood folklore and a guy that everybody knows and recognizes. And Steven, I'm really thrilled, first and foremost. There are certain guys that you bring on that have a distinct and future for obvious reasons, and this one is basically a film, television, and production-based show. So even though it's part of the sports aspect of what we're doing, especially when we get into a particular show or two, the sports and athletic background will certainly appeal to anyone who has worn a jockstrap or wanted to watch different shows on television that pertain to some of the really funny things that take place athletically. Thank you for bringing Barry on with us, Steven.
Well, you're most welcome, Harper. And as you shall recall, a couple of months back, we had Mr. Kerry McCluggage on. We had a wonderful interview with him. And my association with Barry is tied in with Mr. McCluggage. And what's really great, and what this show often does, not every episode, but a lot of them, we combine two of my and two of your favorite subjects, one being sports and the other being movies and Hollywood. And our guest today, Mr. Barry Kemp, is someone who can talk about both sports and movies and sports on the screen, because he is an Emmy winner and he is a producer, and he has produced the fabulous television show from the 1990s, Coach, that starred Craig T. Nelson. And he and Mr. McCluggage are producers who have an option on my book, One Night, Two Teams. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And but I want to welcome Mr. Barry Kemp to Take 5 with Steven Travers. Barry, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me.
Well,
I love your book. I appreciate your book.
Thank you very much. We can get into that, but I think I'm going to start chronologically. Why don't you tell us where you were born and where you were raised?
I was born in Hannibal, Missouri. My parents were from Missouri, and we moved from Hannibal to St. Joseph, Missouri, when I was about 3 or 4, I guess. So I remember nothing about Hannibal and all. Well, actually, I think they moved there earlier than that. I take that back, because I was basically an infant when we moved. But the first time, my parents never took me back to Hannibal until my dad was in the meatpacking business. We moved around a lot. So the first place I remember living was St. Joseph. And then from St. Joseph, we moved to the south side of Chicago. And from there, we moved to Kansas City. From Kansas City, we moved to Iowa. We lived in 3 different cities and towns in Iowa, Perry, Fort Dodge, and Sioux City. Then I went to school at the University of Iowa and ended up, after that, moving to Phoenix, Arizona, initially to help my folks move, because my dad was transferred again. But I met my future wife when I was at Iowa my senior year, and so we got married and moved to Arizona. We were out there for 5 years before we came over here to California. So that I moved around quite a lot, and then those times that I was there, I went to a number of different schools. For some reason, the places that we lived, they kept changing the school district, even though you weren't moving. So I ended up going to three different grade schools, 2 different junior high schools, and 2 different high schools. But I stayed at the University of Iowa the whole time. So that's a little bit of my background.
Well, some of the sports aspects of that, if you don't mind me saying so, Barry, Kinnick Stadium obviously is an American icon, with the history and the kids with the hospital that is within view and all that kind of stuff. Were there any sports-related incidences that happened at Iowa where you go, gosh, this is big time? It's Big Ten, and I'm getting to see some of the basketball obviously is big. Football, of course, is bigger. But were there any particular incidences that helped you with your understanding of the sports world and athletics in general?
Without realizing it at the time, I think the answer is yes. I ended up recalling some things. I didn't. Well, let me tell. I'll tell very quickly about Iowa. One of my memories. First of all, going to Kinnick Stadium for the first time, I was thrilled. I had a good buddy from high school. He was also going to Iowa. Boys had to live in the dorm. They couldn't live any place but the dorm your freshman year. So we were in the same dorm on the same floor, not the same room, but on the same floor. And he loved sports and football too. And we couldn't believe that we were there. We just thought it was great. I wish I could tell you who we played. I do remember playing Oregon State when Bill Earthquake Inyart was their running back. That I do remember. But
1968, I believe.
Is that wow? You've got a great memory. I appreciate it. That's probably exactly right. And I also remember. I famously remember a game that we played Ohio State when Iowa was a pretty lowly team, and Ohio State was somewhere in that top 3. And we went and just got to watch the antics of Woody Hayes on the sideline. Mm-hmm. And Iowa had played kind of an amazing game. And at the very end of the game, Iowa was behind by 6 points. And I want to say the score of the game was 33-27 or something like that. And it might have been 20 something. I don't know. But I know that Iowa was behind by 6 points and started this drive with time running out, and threw a pass into the end zone on the last play of the game that the receiver dove for it, had it, and dropped it. And that was the end of the game. And there were huge groans because we thought we'd scored and tied it up, and all we had to do was kick a field goal to knock off Ohio State. It didn't happen. We're going back to our apartment or the dorm afterward, and we were listening on the radio to the post-game show. And they were interviewing Woody Hayes, and typical of Woody, they said, "What did you think of the game?" And Woody Hayes says, "Iowa was never in the game." We're going, what if we got the ball? They'd have been more than in the game. We'd have won it. But that was Woody. He just couldn't, he was everything that you have ever heard about him or watched about him, I think was true. And the few people that I know who knew him said, no, whatever you think you saw, that's who he was. He had no filter. But that's one of my memories from there. But I loved it. I loved the University of Iowa. I was in theater arts and got interested in writing when I went there. I didn't start off interested in writing, but that's what happened.
So were you on the stage, Barry? Were you on the stage back then?
Yeah. I not knowing what I wanted to do, I just know that I love the entertainment business. And so, I was, I did some plays at Iowa, and it was not until my junior year I had really started getting interested in the writing aspect. And my wife, or at the time was my girlfriend, but now my wife, 55 years, Margaret said, you should, have you ever read Moss Hart's autobiography, Act One? And I said, no, I never have. And she said,
I'm sorry, could you repeat that title again, please?
Act One. Act One.
Are we talking about Shakespeare here?
No. This is Moss Hart.
Oh,
Moss
Moss
Hart,
Hart. Okay.
he wrote an autobiography, Act One,
Okay.
about his relationship with George Kaufman.
Okay.
Largely about his relationship with him, although it was how he got started in his life. And the book was riveting to me. I couldn't put it down.
Mhm.
So at any rate, it was inspiring for me, and I give Margaret credit for that. There it is. Yes, sir. If you've not read it, whether you want to be a writer or be in the business or not, it's just a wonderfully told story. So at any rate, that's so I started off and got completely sucked into the writing side of it. I'll tell you a very quick true anecdote.
Before you do, Barry, I want to pause for just a second.
Yeah.
What was the transition like for you from going on stage? There's a lot of folks that have stage fright, and when they learn to get over that, it becomes easy. It's a breeze. And for you to be out there and memorize lines and learn to over accentuate because you don't want to under accentuate, you learn how to do all those things. I'm thinking that eventually later on, your ability to know what an actor goes through makes it a lot easier for you to write something and produce something with their best intentions in mind. Was there any aspect of that came true for you because you've been on that side of the fence?
Yeah, I don't think I didn't consciously think of that, but I think that that's absolutely true. One of the things that when you're performing or acting, you're trying your best to get inside of a character, to think like the character thinks, and not just say the lines, but and even when you're doing a comedy, you're not trying to get laughs. You're trying to stay true to the character, and the truer you are, generally, the funnier it is. So even if the character is a little bit outrageous. So anyway, I do think it helped. I wasn't consciously aware of it until sometime later, and then I began to realize how much it helped me, because when I would talk to actors, if I had to give my own notes or things like that, I could explain where the thought process came from, and never give a line reading, but just give an understanding of what they're thinking. And if the actor was good, they immediately changed the performance and understood it. And I do that to this day. So
yeah, and having a great relationship with an actor to kind of, these are characters, and unless it's historical, right? If you're trying to play Abraham Lincoln, there are so many books and people that have written about him that you want to be as close to perfect as possible. When you've created a character, and we'll get into some of those, obviously there's some leeway that would allow you to go, oh, that's a great idea. This is a whole different aspect that we can take with this character's role, and we have much more material that we could write about it. But before we get there, you did mention that you went from acting to actually writing. How did that passion develop and turn into something that you would be ending up spending most of the rest of your life doing?
As soon as I started writing, I realized I couldn't stop. I would get up in the morning. It was like an addiction. I just wanted to write, and I just lost complete interest in personally performing. I didn't lose interest in watching performances, but I just liked being on the other side of it. And I just felt, I don't know, I just felt like I suddenly found myself. One thing you wanted, and one thing was performing was something I thought I wanted. Writing was something that I had to do. You couldn't, it's an addiction. You couldn't stop it. I couldn't not write. And I had the experience of, so I took this playwriting class, which I'd never taken, and I'd never written a play, but I had what I wanted to learn. And so Kenneth Cameron was the head of the playwriting department. He taught this class. There were about 12 of us in there, not a lot of people, obviously, in a little room in the basement of the studio theater at Iowa. And Ken started off by saying, he says, so let me tell you before we get into anything, how I grade. he said, if you do a lot of work in here and I think you have talent, you'll get an A. If you do a lot of work and I don't think you have talent, I'll give you a B. If I think you have talent but you don't do any work, I'll give you a C. If I don't think you have talent and you don't do any work, I'll give you a D. And I don't give Fs because it's playwriting, it's not medicine. So he said that now that you know the way I grade, because I know that's always important to students, if anybody wants to leave, they can. And there was this kind of odd, uncomfortable pause. And then about 3 or 4 people got up and walked out, leaving the class with about 8 of us. And there was some sort of nervous tittering. And as they closed the door, and he just looked at the 7 or 8 of us and said, "So you all think you've got talent?" Which is an interesting challenge. So at any rate, he wanted us to come up with an idea for a play. He says, and it could be 1 act. It doesn't matter. Just come up with an idea. And I had an idea that I'd been thinking of. So I everybody went in to meet with him privately. And I went to his office and I laid out this whole 2-act play. And I had it, the 2 characters, the lead character, I had everything about it. I had the beginning, the middle, the end, what the arc was and everything. And he looks at me, he let me talk for like 20 minutes. And then he says, "You'll get an idea like that, maybe if you're lucky, once every 10 years. And I said, "I don't know," because I said, "This just came to me." He goes, "I'm telling you, it'll be 10 years before you get another one." So he says, at any rate, he says, "You're not going to be in the underwriting playwriting class." He says, "I'm going to put you in the graduate playwriting class." And I said, I don't think I'd be comfortable with that. I haven't actually written anything. I've just thought of this idea. And I said, I wouldn't be comfortable with people that have been doing it. He says, "Calm down." He says, "First of all, there is no one in the graduate playwriting class. It'll just be you. And you and I will meet once a week, and I'll read whatever pages you've done, and we'll have an hour conversation." And that's how I finished my play. And it was successful enough that he recommended that I go to the head of the theater department, the main stage theater, not the department, to see if they would let me do it on the main stage at Iowa. And so I went and met with David Thayer, and I told him that I had this idea for a play and that Ken Cameron thought it was really good. And is it possible that I could do this on the main stage? And he looked kind of puzzled, and he said, "Well, I don't know." He says, there's no one's ever done it. And I said, is there a rule or anything about it? He says, "There's no rule about it. I can't think of why you couldn't do it." So he said, okay. And there was an opening in the spring. And so we produced it on the main stage. And it turned out that somebody from the Board of Regents came down to see it from Des Moines. And it ended up that they gave a grant, an undergraduate grant for playwrights at Iowa to be able to do their own show once a year. So every year now, somebody's got a show, and it happened by pure accident, but made me feel great. And Ken Cameron did one other wonderful thing for me. He, when I was leaving Iowa, had graduated, he just told me, he says, do you have a TV? And I said, "Well, I have a TV. Yeah." I said, it only gets Cedar Rapids. So I said, it's a little crummy old black and white, but that's what he says, "So have you ever seen the Mary Tyler Moore Show?" And I said, "I've heard of it, but I've never seen it." He said, "Well, if I were you, I would try to meet the people that do the Mary Tyler Moore Show." Because he says, "I think you've got that sensibility." And I thought, well, that'd be great. I don't have any idea how in the world to do that. So, I'm telling you more than you wanted to know, probably. But at any rate,
Barry, I want to get into that, but I want to touch on a couple of things that you said.
Sure.
First, I believe Hannibal, Missouri, is the hometown of Mark Twain.
That is correct.
So there's some serious lineage going on right there. Second, you mentioned Fort Dodge.
Yes.
I'm sure you're aware of the fact that I played professional baseball and also collegiate summer baseball. So I played baseball there, and I also played baseball in St. Joseph, Missouri.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes, I have been there, and I've played there. I played all over the Midwest in the Jayhawk League. and also in the minor leagues. And then you mentioned Moss Hart. That was your inspiration. For me, my inspiration was Adventures in the Screen Trade by William Goldman, a great book, which I'm sure you're familiar with and probably read. And then lastly, I couldn't help but think about that you and I have a lot in common. Now, you wrote your stage play when you were a mere lad, and I did too. I was a little bit older because I gone into pro baseball and then came back to school.
Right.
I was at USC, and I wasn't majoring in film, but I took some film classes, and they had a famous professor, and he had a screenwriting class, and I wrote a screenplay in that class, just like you wrote a stage play. And they didn't create a play for me, or the Steven Travers wing of the USC Film School, but I did print it out, and it was about all my friends at USC in this little bar that we hung out at, and that play was produced many times while drinking beer in this play, and each of the characters in the play would play themselves. So it created a lot of fun. But
sounds like it.
I thought I wanted to get that in there. And the last thing, you're 100% correct. When you start to write, and for me, I'd gone in other directions, and I really didn't decide to actually write as a so-called profession until I was 35 years old. I did other things and failed at most things I tried. When it really hit, it was, as you say, an addiction. So I just wanted to get that in there. So now you're, Harper, unless you want to have some additional questions at this point in Barry's life.
Well, there's so many things, Barry, that you mentioned there, and the key word for me would be relationships. You started very early building relationships with either your professors or some others, and then you mentioned, I don't know anybody at Mary Tyler Moore, but you were willing to reach out. And I guess the connectivity that is in the world of writing and producing, of being on that side of the camera, was something that you were learning to develop from a very early portion of the time when writing did become the goal that you had in your life. Is there some truth to that?
There is. The person that I actually met was Jerry Van Dyke.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'll tell you very quickly how that happened. I had always thought he was funny. He was appearing, again, at this point in our life, Margaret and I were married, and we were living in Glendale, Arizona, the suburb of Phoenix. And Jerry Van Dyke was appearing in Scottsdale on New Year's Eve at a nightclub out there. And I asked Margaret and my best friend in Phoenix, Jack, and his wife, Diane, I said, you guys want to go and see Jerry Van Dyke on New Year's Eve and get tickets? And they all said, yeah, they would do that. They were sort of doing it for me, but they said they would do it. So we went out there and we saw the first show, and then we knew he was going to do a second show, and we were going to stay watch the second show, even though it was the same show. But we saw that he, the first show we saw that he took a cigarette break, basically, to let Shirley, his wife, sing a song or two and give him a little break. And he went out front. And so when we were there for the second show, got to the same place, and he took a cigarette break and asked her to sing a song or two. And Margaret and Jack, my buddy, and his wife Diane, they all sit there and they said, you go out and introduce yourself. And I said, and say what? They said, well, you know, you write, you think he's funny. And I said, yeah, but I said, I don't know what I would say to him. And they said, well, you always say you can't meet people here, which was true. I was always saying that. So they finally goaded me into it. So I went out, and there was, I don't know, 5 or 6 people around getting an autograph and talking to him. And so I waited and just hung back, and they left, and I went up, and I just introduced myself, and I said, I've always been a fan of yours. And I said, I just wanted to say hi. And he says, so what do you do? And I said, well, I said, what I want to do is, I said, I want to be a writer. I said, I write a lot of stuff. But I said, but I make a living right now selling life insurance, which is to support myself and my wife. But she was working too. He said, well, have you got anything for me? And I said, well, not necessarily specifically, but yeah, I think I do. And he says, well, told me where he was staying. And he says, why don't you, I said, I get up very early. He says, well, why don't you drop it by the hotel at like by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, if you can. And I said, sure. And he said, okay. And he says, I'll take a look at it. So I went back in and I told him, and they said, well, that's great. And I said, yeah, but I don't have anything to give him. I said, I said, I'm just going to have to go home and write it, literally. So we went after the midnight show, drove back to our little plate house in Glendale, and Margaret went to bed. Or actually, our compressor had gone out. Our house was freezing. So I took her to my folks' house. They lived in Phoenix.
Yeah, but you are in Arizona, Barry.
Pardon me?
You are in Arizona.
I'm definitely in Arizona. Yes, I'm definitely in Arizona. And
Iowa or Vermont might have been a different career. Might never have gotten off the floorboards.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, there was no snow, but it was chilly. At any rate, we did have a fireplace, and so I lit a fire, and I spent 2 or 3 hours just writing basically material for Jerry based on what I heard him do in his stand-up, and packed it all up, drove back out at about 5 a.m, dropped it off at his hotel, and the guy did the check-in counter. Said, he says, does he know about this? I said, yeah, he asked for it. He's expecting it. He said, okay. So anyway, so I gave it to him. I had moved Margaret over to my parents' house because their compressor was not broken. So she was staying there. So I go to pick her up, and it's about somewhere between 6 and 6:30 in the morning. And I walk in the front door, and my mom has this odd look on her face holding the phone. And she goes, couldn't figure it out why Jerry Van Dyke was calling me, because I left my folks' phone number. So anyway, I get on the phone, and he says, well, can you meet me for breakfast? And I said, yeah, sure. And he says, so you know where I'm staying? He says, just get. And I said, okay. And he says, I get up early. So he says, is that okay? And I said, yeah, well, I've been up all night. So I said, yeah, I can do that. So anyway, I drove out and met him for breakfast. And he said, I've been looking all my life for somebody that can write like this for me. He says, did you get all of this from just tonight? I go, no. I said, I've been a fan of yours. I told you for years, but I said, I can kind of hear the rhythms that people speak in, and I can adapt to that. And he said, right now, he says, well, listen, he says, I'm going to put you under contract. And he says, you can write material for me. And he said, I'm going to show your work around. Yeah, because
Sight unseen. He offered you a contract just after a couple of papers that you sent. Wow.
That's it. Yeah. And when it wasn't a big contract, but it was money that I could afford to write on and not have to do another job. And that was how I got my start. And then I'm still living in Phoenix, and he's showing everybody he shows my work to, which is mostly actor friends of his, all liked it. But he hadn't shown it to anybody that actually had any ability to push it forward. So Jerry's first show in television had been My Mother the Car, which the story editor, the first job in television for the story editor on that show turned out to be Jim Brooks, or James L. Brooks. So Jerry had never had much. He's had a good relationship with Jim on the show, but he hadn't spoken to him basically in years. But he still had his contact, and he called and left a message for Jim, and Jim called him back, and they hadn't talked for a long time, and he says, well, "What are you calling me about?" And he says, "I've got a writer that I think you should meet." So Jim said, "Okay." Well, he says, "Give him my number, and I'll talk to him." So Jerry calls me and says, "Jim wants you to call him," and so I call him, and on the day that I'm calling, this particular day was in the headline in the entertainment section of the Phoenix paper, the Arizona Republic, the announcement that the Jim and Ed Weinberger, Stan Daniels, and Dave Davis were all leaving MTM to form their own company, and it was the headline. And so I just found this out. So at any rate, I call the number that Jerry tells me to call, and the receptionist says, "Will he know what this is about?" And I said, "I think so." And so sure enough, he gets on the phone, and he says, well, Jerry, we read your material. He says, "I don't know if you've heard, but," he says, we're starting our own company." And I said, "Yeah, it's the biggest headline here." And he says, "Well, again," he says, we don't know yet what we're doing, but everybody's read your script, and whatever we're doing, we want you to do it with us." And I said, "Okay." He says, "Now, can you fly over here to meet?" He said, "First of all, do we have to send you a ticket, or can you?" And I said, "Well, I can afford a flight to LA." It was about $55, which was about all I could afford, but I could do that at any rate. And I went over there and I met him, and it was absolutely magical. They were working on a mini series, Cindy, which was a takeoff set in World War II, takeoff on Cinderella. And they asked me to read their first 20 pages, which I went into a room and did. And I came back in, and they said, "What did you think?" And I said, "Well, I think it's really good." And they said, "Okay." And they said, "Well, sit down." They said, "The way we write is we just pitch everything out loud, and just jump in when you feel like you have an idea." And I felt totally intimidated and completely out of my element, because I'd never done anything like this. So I just started listening, and I'm telling you this only because it's literally the first joke I ever pitched professionally. They were working on a scene where Cindy came in, and the Wicked Stepsisters were getting ready for the ball, and she comes in and says, I don't have anything to wear to the ball." And the wickedest stepsister sits there and says, "Honey, I don't know how to tell you this, but you ain't going to the ball." And I said, the other wicked stepsister sits there and says, "I know how to tell her. You ain't going to the ball." And they all cracked up. And Jim says, "Did I tell you he was great?" And I was basically part of the family from then on. It was just magical. And it was my version of Mosshart meeting George S. Kaufman.
Well, I guess being in the right place at the right time it always is a great acronym, for how some relationships are developed and built. Obviously, Jerry Van Dyke had a tremendous trust level with you from a very early experience, right?
Yeah.
You wrote a couple of pages for him. You drove 3 times to see him, to give him the material, and then to meet with him on top of that. You've already spoken a lot about the relationships, but I guess your ability to be able to speak your mind and not be afraid. I've got something to contribute. What was that experience like? I know you just gave us that example, but as a mature man now, you've seen a lot of things. Is that something that you look for in kids that are trying to write, or first timers that you get a chance to meet? Their ability to be able to express themselves, but not dominate the conversation and make it all about them, to work together as a team. Correct?
That is largely correct. Yes, I think that I do. If I like somebody's writing, if I think there's something special to it, I'm pretty easy to engage. And if I don't, I won't shine them on. I say, and I said, I'm only one opinion, so don't take the fact that I don't have any interest in meaning that nobody else will. But I'm just saying, but if it's something that I really can relate to, I'm eager to do that. And the first thing that I really try hard to convey, because I find I'll just say new writers, not necessarily, they're not all young. Sometimes they're much older than young, but they don't like to rewrite. They will generally, if you give an idea, they'll say, "Let me start over." And I go, "You don't need to start over. Your idea is good and it starts off fine, but just explore it." I said, "Get deeper. Don't just start from page 1 every time." And it's really hard for some to do that, because they don't feel like that's writing. They feel like, well, I've already written this. What else do I do with it? But that is in fact what you do. I mean, and I don't care whether you're a novelist or a screenwriter or a half-hour writer, or novelist, whatever you are. You just writers who Steve knows, you probably all know. That old saying about writing is rewriting is really true. I don't know if that is no different than an actor rehearsing and finding the character, and it's the same sort of exploration, and you're trying to find it in the words on the page. So, the fact that you don't get it right the first time doesn't mean you don't know what you're doing.
Let me jump in for a second, make a couple observations about writing and about rewriting. And one of my favorite writers is the great John Milius, who wrote Apocalypse Now. And you were talking about a unique experience with your professor, who talked about how he was going to grade and basically was kind of, I guess you could say he was trying to winnow out the talent or the wheat from the chaff, however you want to describe it. Right. Similarly with Milius, he had a teacher, Erwin Blacker. I don't know if you knew him. Was at the USC Film School. And Blacker was notorious that people would write something and he would yawn, or he would say, I think I'm going to go play tennis, and he'd get people to cry in the class, but he liked Milius, and he says, you're the guy. And it sounds to me like right from the get-go, and I don't know many stories like that, and it's certainly not my story. I got lucky fairly early to write some stuff for Frank Capra, but I certainly didn't. I mean, I can't imagine, and you're living in Scottsdale, Arizona, and Jerry Van Dyke reads something at 6 a.m. You've had a blessed, at least a blessed early part of your career.
I think so.
You mentioned something earlier. He said, I think you said, well, I would say, I think you said something like, I'm not sure how it happened. And in my humble opinion, I think I do know how it happened. I think it was destiny for you, my friend.
Did you ask me a question there, or that was a comment?
No, I was just observing how you were talking about your early days in school, because I saw a lot that I went through. I wish it could have been that easy for me. And certainly you showed that picture, or Logan showed that picture of the Mary Tyler Moore show. Boy, there was some serious comedic talent on that show, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was never on that show, obviously, because the guys that left that show when they hired me.
Yeah, but that was like your first, you mentioned they said you should get in touch with these guys. You never did get in touch with them?
Well, yeah, through Jerry, because Jim Brooks was one of the creators of the Mary Tyler Moore show. So, and they had left MTM to form their own company. So he and Ed Weinberger, Stan Daniels, and Dave Davis between the four of them had created the Bob Newhart show and also the Mary Tyler Moore show. So they were
interesting. You're told, okay, you should get in touch with the guys in the Mary Tyler Moore show. You go see Jerry Van Dyke. Is it in your mind that Jerry Van Dyke?
Not at all. No.
I mean, he has some connection with his brother, who obviously had been on the show with Mary.
I knew he had a connection to Dick. I certainly didn't know if he had a connection.
You're just there to see entertainment with your wife and a friend.
Yeah. And I honestly did not expect to even introduce myself to him. If I hadn't been goaded into it, I wouldn't have. That's just not in my nature to go do that. But the fact that they were goading me into it and saying, well, basically, I don't want to hear any more about you want to be a writer if you don't want to go up and meet somebody that you admire. And that's what made me do it. So like I said, I give my friends and Margaret a tremendous amount of credit for sort of embarrassing me into going up and saying, well, if you believe you can do it, you can do it, then go out and introduce yourself. And that is what I did. But I had to be pushed a little bit. It wasn't something that I was eager to do, but it worked out. It worked out great. And Taxi ended up being the first series that I did, because that was what they were creating at that time. So that was a pretty great experience.
It's a groundbreaking series, especially. This is considered the seminal groundbreaking series for women comics. I mean, there've been the Carol Burnett show, there've been others, but Mary Tyler Moore was a single woman. She wasn't married. A lot of people have talked about that. There was a Mary Tyler Moore documentary recently that talked about how she was portrayed in that show, and that it was groundbreaking at the time, that you have a single woman who works and living, on her own, and making it in the world. And it was one of my favorite shows.
Yeah, I think, and the story that I remember hearing about that, but from a network standpoint, was that they were concerned. And maybe you've heard this, but they were concerned with that concept of her being a single woman that was never married. They said, won't audiences think that she's separated or divorced from Dick Van Dyke? Because she became so associated with that show. So that again, that was sort of the network fear.
But you didn't write in there that she was a former dancer, did you?
I didn't have anything to do with the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Never wrote an episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. They'd already left the show. So Taxi was the first show that that was the first show that I did.
Okay.
And by the way, I have to, this is one quick thing. When I knew what they were doing, I'd read the script, and I came back home to Margaret and I said, I've got to come up with some ideas for the stories for an episode. And I said, I don't know anything about driving a cab. I don't know anything about, there was no pilot to see at the time. I said, I really don't know anything about it. And she said, and Margaret, who is an avid reader, she says, well, have you ever read Studs Terkel's book, Working? And I said, well, I haven't. And she said, well, there's a chapter in there about cab drivers. And one of the chapters, they talk about that they all have a favorite cab. So I said, well, that's interesting. I said, I like that, because there's 4 different cab drivers and they're focusing on. I said, so everybody's got a story about that cab. So I came back and pitched an idea I remember I went in to pitch this, and I said, I have an idea. I said, has anybody read Studs Terkel's book, Working? And Jim, I remember turning to the others and going, he reads Studs Terkel. And I said, no, I don't. My wife reads Studs Terkel, and she told me about it. But I said, at any rate, he's got a chapter on everybody having their favorite cab. And Jim immediately jumped on it and said, that's a great idea. He says, basically, that gives everybody in the show a story. And so we collectively started pitching it out, and I went back and wrote my first draft, and turned it in. And their assistant at the time, a woman by the name of Robin, I walked in to get my first notes, and I turned the script in, and the script was 56 pages, and half-hour scripts were generally in the highest, sort of in the low 40s. And so
we don't need advertising and commercials.
Yeah. So I just cut all those out. So she looks at me like I'm an idiot, and she says, 56 pages. And I said, yeah. And she said, they're never going to shoot 56 pages. And I said, well, I'm just telling you, I just put in everything they told me to put in. At any rate, they're ready to see me. I go in, and first thing Jim says is, 56 pages, huh? I said, I know it's long, and I can cut it down. He says, no, I don't want to cut it down. He says, all we need is one more sequence for one of the other cab drivers. And he says, we could make it a 2-parter, which is what they did. So at any rate, so my first script that I thought was getting thrown out instead was doubled. And I give a lot of credit to Margaret, but it also shows you can't. It's hard, but if you believe that what you've done is worth reading, and I just assumed that I would be cutting 15 pages out, but I didn't want to cut out anything that they had suggested without showing them that I was listening. And it all worked out amazingly well.
Well, you start with Taxi. You're getting a feel for the business aspect. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, there's money involved with how much you're going to get paid. There's whether or not the show, there's always the pilot, how many episodes a network is going to pay for. There's both excitement and then great tragedy. No one picked it up. What was it like for you, knowing full well that there was an opportunity and the folks that were watching liked the show? Mm-hmm. Obviously, the characters began to develop, and we got to learn about Mary Lou Henner, Tony Danza, of course, an early but great career starting with
Chris Lloyd.
Everybody,
Andy Kaufman, yeah,
right, and especially him, Christopher, Danny DeVito, of course. Let's not forget him. And you're doing things to help their careers while they're doing things that, when they do it right, it's helping yours. But there's a real, again, I'm bringing up the relationships and being able to work together, and how critically important it is for them to have input. Hey, I like this page here, but I don't feel comfortable with that. Was there any of that in terms of your early development?
From a cast standpoint, you mean? Are you talking about?
Yeah, not just specifically that cast, but yes, any of the others that you have where, yes, I have to intermingle with these folks, and let's find how we be able to change, how some people won't change at all, but eventually the goal to get to a very successful show and to win an Emmy Award or just to stay on the air for another season or two.
I mean, I think that well, first of all, I had the very good fortune of working with a creative powerhouse in Brooks and Weinberger, Davis and Daniels, and there was a certain protection there because I was under that umbrella. So I don't think that studios or networks necessarily looked at me as an outsider at that point. I was part of that group, and so I think they became interested in me because Brooks and those guys were interested in me. But then they also saw that that particular script that I wrote that I was talking about that ended up being a 2-part episode did get some. It didn't win anything, but it got some nominations from the Writers Guild.
And how old are you at this time, Barry?
I was by the time Taxi, I was 27. 27.
And there are some folks that haven't seen 27 in 3 decades that you're probably working with. And was there a relationship that you needed to develop to mold and to capture with some of the other writers to go, hey, I'm new, I'm the young kid, but I belong here. And they want you to belong here. Hey, we're working together, not opposite one another. We need to do everything we can collectively to win this and get it done.
I think I was lucky too, because Jim and those guys had hired Glenn and Les Charles to be the producers. Well, they were the producers. Jim and those guys were the executive producers, but they hired Glenn and Les to really do all the story work and produce the show. They and reporting obviously to Jim and those guys. So I had a really good relationship with Glenn and Les, and there was really initially nobody else there except them and me. So I got to talk to them a lot. I got to pick their brains a lot. We got along really well. So that was, again, I was just fortunate. Because I was the first one outside of that MTM group that was brought on, I got a certain amount of attention, and I didn't get, I didn't sense any people saying, prove it to me or anything like that. I really didn't. They were all very, very supportive and liked what I was doing or what I was pitching, suggesting, whatever. So it became I was just learning how shows developed and how writing teams developed and how rooms were developing and how, without realizing it, observing how to run a room, because that's a whole different thing than being a part of the team and being the quote, the general, if you will, and making the decision about we will go forward with this or we won't go forward with that. So anyway, Glenn and Les and I just had a really good relation and still do. Les and his wife Zora live in Montecito, not 5 minutes from us, and we still stay in touch and have dinner occasionally. And Glenn lives up north, so I don't see him very much. But
well, as I mentioned earlier, Barry, I know Glenn. He lives in Monterey.
Right.
That's where I met him, and he told me that Cheers was based on Bill Spaceman Lee, who's a good friend of mine, and now a neighbor of mine. And Bill always said that. Bill always says, "Yeah, I never saw any residuals, but that's what the story is." But I'm interested to know, because I know how Hollywood is, and I know there's always naysayers. Okay, you have this idea, you have this show, you want to call it Taxi. Did anybody come forward and say, what, you're going to do like a television show of the De Niro movie? Or did anyone come up with that or offer any sort of objections based upon that theory?
Well, if they did, I never heard it because I wasn't there when Jim and them pitched it to the network. And in all fairness, I think my guess is that when the network heard it, that probably wasn't what they were thinking they'd be getting. I'm sure they privately talked among themselves and they go, "But do you think that's what that we thought we were buying?" But I think they had so much confidence in them, and they had a lot of creative power. In all honesty, there weren't. I don't think there was many people saying no to them after the success they'd had with MTM. So we never felt during Taxi, we never felt any quote pressure from the network. We were just shielded from that. Basically, if Jim heard it or Ed heard it, they didn't share it with us. They never gave us a note saying the network wants this. They would either agree with the network note or they would reject it. So whatever came from them, not from the network. So when the first time I ever had to actually work with a network was on Newhart, and then that opened up another area that I had not been. Frank, I had just been shielded from it. I hadn't had to experience it, and it fortunately wasn't bad at all because I had to go pitch the idea for Newhart to Kim LeMasters, who turned out to be not only a great executive but also a good writer in his own right, and a very not only creative but attuned to the creative process and very open to it, especially if it seemed original. I was fortunate that that Newhart's deal was with CBS, and that Kim was head of comedy at CBS, and of course I still had to go pitch it to Bob, which was actually kind of funny because we met at the bar at the Bel Air Hotel, and it was like 4 in the afternoon or something, and we were the only ones in there except for the bartender. There might have been one other couple or something in there. Very quiet. And I had come up with the idea of, he said, well, tell me what you got. And I said, well, I said, are you familiar with the Kaufman and Hart play George Washington Slept Here? And he says, no, not really. And I said, well, it takes place in New England. It's about this inn where George Washington had slept. And I said, anyway, I thought that there might be something really interesting. And I think you're thought of as a very cerebral comedian. And I said, you're from Chicago. So I said, I thought if you were a writer, but a writer of how-to books, so that you could, your biggest success so far has been How to Build a Barbecue, but you've done a number of how-to books, and but you've always been a history buff, and you've lived in New York, and you find this little quaint inn in New England that you think that might be great to buy that and live there. And I said, and you can still do your writing. And he said, yeah. He said, so I like that idea. He said, so you're, he said, it's funny. He says, because I was actually thinking of an idea. My youngest daughter's going off to college this fall, and he said, she's going to Washington. And he said, I was thinking that, funny. He says, I was thinking like maybe I was like the manager of like a Hilton or something like that. And I would have to deal with all of these people and my bosses and everything else. And I said, yeah. I said, but I said, the only thing about that is I said, I don't really see you as being subservient to anybody. I said, I don't think your persona is that. I said, I like the idea that you may have crazy people in the inn, but at least in the inn, I said, you're still the owner. And I said, I think having somebody above you just feels like that's not the character that I'm used to seeing. But I said, that's, obviously you could disagree. And he says, no, I understand what you're saying. He says that makes sense. So he says, well, go ahead. And he says, we don't have to agree on everything. I said, well, we both came up with ideas that take place in America. And I said, I'm on the East Coast, you're on the West Coast, but I said, we're in the ballpark. He said, no, I get it. And we had a good time talking. And I'll just tell you another quick anecdote. So I write the pilot, and I'm very happy, I think, with how it turns out. And so I turn it into MTM, who of course has sent it to Bob, and I have not turned it into the network yet. Well, I wouldn't anyway, because MTM would be turning it in, not me. So I get a call from Arthur Price, and he says, can I talk to you? And I said, yeah. So I went up to his office, and we're sitting around this. He had a round table that he always talked to people from. And he said, so I read your script. And I said, yeah. And he says, I have to tell you the truth. He says, I just don't think it's very funny. I said, oh, really? He says, yeah. He says, I'm sorry, but I just have to say it. He says, I just didn't, I think it needs some work. And I said, well, tell me, like, specifically what? And it said, the script was laying on his desk, so I just picked it up and I just started reading from it. He goes, well, he says, okay. He says, it's funny when you read it, but he says, I don't see it. I don't think it's funny. And I said, well, if you think it's funny when I read it, I think when Bob does it, I think it'll be even funnier. And at that moment, literally, his assistant comes in and says, Bob's on the phone. And Arthur says, we're going to find out. And so he picks up the phone. He says, yeah, I'm sitting here with him right now. Yeah, he says, I read it. Yeah, I was just, I agree. And he cuts the phone and says, he loves it. And from then on, there was no problems with it. If Bob loves it, then I love it.
To me, if
Excuse me 1 second.
I remember that show.
Oh, I can't. Sorry.
I watched that show. It was a great show, but I'm very familiar with Newhart. Newhart, I think the word for Bob Newhart's style is droll.
Yes.
And I think you knew that. And so would I be correct in assuming that you wrote it knowing that his style is droll and that maybe it doesn't read funny, but it will sound funny? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And yes, I was very specifically writing it with his voice in mind. And you meaning a reader, has to know Bob's rhythms. Bob obviously knows his rhythms. So he knew the script worked for him. But Arthur, who knew Bob obviously very well, didn't necessarily have that ear to hear how to interpret that coming out of Bob's mouth would be funny, with all of his occasional stammering and pauses and everything else that he puts into it. You don't have to write that in the script. I never insulted him by telling him where to pause. I would just let him go. But yeah, that is a part of it. Having an ear, especially if you're writing it for somebody. If you're writing it just for yourself, then you're listening for an actor to capture what you're trying to write. But if you're writing it for an actor who already has a persona, then you're really trying to capture their rhythms, their sense of humor. You're trying to get inside their head. They're not trying to get inside yours.
Well, you've written for Bob Newhart and you've written for Robin Williams. I mean, they're both comics, but that's about as different as you can get. I don't think you can get more different than those two guys.
Well, I didn't quote write for Robin Williams. And I didn't write Patch Adams. I supervised it.
Okay.
We had hired a writer to do it, and there may have been some rewriting, a lot of notes and things like that. But I don't want to. I did not write the script to Patch Adams.
All right, but the point is, I mean, you did produce it, and so obviously had input in it, and you also were involved with Newhart. And the point I was making is that you can't get more different than those two.
Well, that's true.
Comedians. I mean,
that is
true. Both comedians, and they're both American comedians, but there is two different people as you could possibly imagine.
Yeah. And by the way, just going on, I mean, the same would be true of Craig T. Nelson, who has a completely different
now
a different countenance and everything.
Forrest Evashevsky.
Pardon me?
Was he Forrest Evashevsky?
No, he really wasn't. I know who Forrest Evashevsky is. I may have met him once, but he was not. No, in fact, I'm sorry.
Forrest Evashevsky was the football coach at Iowa, I believe, when they went to the Rose Bowl 1959.
That's correct.
The Bears. Alex Karras was on that team, and of course, went to the University of Iowa. So that was that's why.
And then he was the athletic director for many years.
Yeah, he was involved for many years.
Yeah.
I'll
tell you. Hopefully, I'll keep this short. I had done this is after Newhart. I had done a comedy miniseries for MTM called Fresno, when miniseries were very hot, but there hadn't been a comedy miniseries. And I had been reading with a friend of mine, Mark Genzel, no longer with us, unfortunately, but he was somebody that I had known for a number of years from Chicago, and was also a writer and a performer. But we found this article that ranked 100 cities in America from the city that had the most of what people wanted the most to the 100th city that had the least of what people wanted most. And that city was Fresno. And first of all, the name is funny. And then the second part of it was the fact that it's the raisin capital of the world, or at least it claims to be, which I thought, it's not even wine, it's raisins. It's just, we thought that was funny. And I said, I think we could make this a mini series. Would mean literally a 4 or 5 part mini series, not unlike Dynasty or Dallas or any of Falcon Crest. Those are all of. I said, let's just do a primetime soap opera miniseries. So went and pitched that to CBS, who thought the idea was Kim LeMasters thought the idea was very funny. Agreed to go forward and do it. And coming off of that, I had cast Dabney Coleman as the arch villain to Carol Burnett. And Fresno had received some, it was a 5-hour miniseries, but it had received some, quite a lot of some critical acclaim. And Dabney had enjoyed the experience a lot. And so his attorney manager slash manager had called me, asked to meet with me because Dabney wanted to know if I would be interested in creating a series for him. And I said, well, it's not, yeah. I said, from an interest standpoint, yes. I said, I really don't know that I have time to do that. But I said, I'm flattered that, he enjoyed the experience with Fresno. And I said, let me think about it. And I went home from the meeting that night. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is something I very rarely do. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was having a dream about Kay Stevenson. Now, Kay Stevenson is somebody I've never met, don't even know what they look like, but I knew that he was the head coach of the Buffalo Bills. And I thought, why in the world would I be dreaming about Kay Stevenson? And then I thought, oh, wait a minute. I probably went to sleep thinking about Dabney Coleman, who had just done Buffalo Bill. And Buffalo Bill made me think of the Buffalo Bills. And the Buffalo Bills, I knew that Kay Stevenson was the coach. And literally, I almost sat up in bed and went, wait a minute, Dabney Coleman as a football coach may not be a bad idea. And I'd never done this before or since. I got up at literally 3 or 3:30 in the morning, and I started just writing frantically. And I arced out not the episodes, but I arced out where the series began to where the series would end. And I said, and the point is, this is where it's going to end. If it ends after a season, I'll end it there. If it ends after 5 seasons, I'll end it there, and whatever. So when I went in to pitch it, because I really did have a complete miniseries, they bought it. So Dabney had really liked the experience of working on it, as did Carol Burnett. So when I went to, I didn't go back to CBS to pitch this because I didn't think that this was necessarily what they would want to do. But then I realized that because I knew Hart was there, that I couldn't. It would be offensive if I didn't go to CBS first. So I went in sort of thinking this is not something you're going to want to do. And Kim again totally got it. Just thought it was really funny, and it was. He says, yeah, if you can get Carol Burnett, well, we'll do it. But so I did start writing the script, which they asked me to do. So at least they were buying a script, and although it was a long script because it was 5 hours, but anyway, I did it. They thought the script was great, and they sent it to Carol, who read it and immediately wanted to meet. And we had a fabulous lunch meeting. Just really got along well, and she's so smart, and especially about she's smart about comedy and smart about she has sort of the same process that writers have, that she doesn't try to be funny. She's trying to get to the underneath what that character is, even if the character is outrageous, and then it just comes off as brilliant. Any rate, now to back, how did that work? How did that translate? Well, like I said, I thought of that because I'd worked with Dabney Coleman, and I said, that got this idea gave me the idea for Coach. But I still wasn't thinking of Dabney. And so I went in and I wrote out crazy. I wrote, like I said, I didn't write out the episodes. I arced the 100 episode arc of where the series would begin and where it would end. And I went in to ABC, who was interested in doing a series or a mini series. So I went in to pitch it to them, and I was trying to figure out how to pitch it. So the way I pitched it was I said, I have an idea about a guy who is in his 40s. He's in a highly competitive profession that is everybody feels like they know what that profession is, but very, very few people know how it actually works from the inside. And I said, so I knew it had to be something universal. And I said, so I thought about, I said, it's a high, and I said, by the way, this guy is so ambitious that his job and is so intense that it has cost him his marriage. It's cost him his relationship with his daughter. The only people that he really has are the people that work for him and around him. And I said, that's in essence his family. And I said, and they were nodding, and there's like 3 or 4 of them in the room nodding. And I said, so I thought about making him a TV executive, I said, but they all laughed. And I said, but I didn't really think that would be relatable to most people. So I said, well, what would be relatable to most people in America? And I said, well, what's more relatable than a college football coach in the Midwest? Everybody feels like they know what that is, or they know of them, even if they don't know anybody personally. And they went, they said, that's great. I think they were partly relieved that I wasn't going to pitch a story about a network executive. Instead, I was pitching about a football coach. But they said, that's great. Yes, exactly. So they said, okay, well, let's call ABC. But they said, this sounds great. So we left. Carrie McCluggage was in the meeting with me, and
is this how you Carrie?
Yeah, Carrie McCluggage was in the meeting. They loved the idea too, and I had a deal at that time with Universal. I'd left MTM, so we came back and feeling really good about it. And I walked into my office, and my assistant's on the phone, and she says, "ABC's on the phone." And I said, "Okay." So I went to my office. I pick up the phone, and they said, well, we called Cap Cities, and they didn't buy it. And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Yeah, they said they just didn't get it." I said, "Huh?" And they said, "Would you? Could I ask him? Could I ask first of all what you told him it was? I'm just curious." And they said, "What you told us was that you wanted to do a series about a college football coach." And I said, "That isn't what I told you. What I told you was I wanted to do a series about a guy who was highly ambitious in a very competitive field that people think they know, but very few people do. And I said I thought about making him a TV executive, but I didn't think people could relate to that. So I made him something more relatable, like a college football coach." And they went, "Yeah, that's not what we pitched." They said, "Would you call Cap Cities and pitch that?" And I go, "Well, yeah, they've rejected it." But I said, "I'll go ahead and." So I did. They gave me the number, and I called people in New York who I'd never met. And I said, this is what I pitched. And then I pitched them the very same thing. And they said, well, that's not at all what we heard. They said, well, that sounds good. And that's how it came about. That's how Coach basically got on the air. But I pitched it as powerful network executives who had given up family and friendships and everything else so that they could relate to it.
Got to think on the fly when you make a change as quickly as you did there, right, Barry? I mean,
You do.
You go from a world that you're around and probably could write all kinds of different stories that were actually funny because they occurred, and repeat those. Was there an athletic background that you had where you could say, I can find out how locker room, how coaches' meetings, game day situations, and then for obviously the family, that would be funny, but also interesting, and develop and meshing those two into a Reese's peanut butter bar, right? Where you got chocolate, you got the peanut butter, and it tastes great, right?
Yeah. Well, you're asking me a good question, Harper, because I really didn't have that kind of experience. I mean, I played sports, but not at a college level, and not in what I was going to be writing about. In all honesty, but I like when somebody asks me that, frankly, because we did an episode. It might have been the 100th episode. I can't remember, but we did an episode where the first time that Hayden had ever been invited to a college football coaches conference. He'd never been included, and these were the top higher echelon coaches. And so we had a number of coaches on the show. We had George Allen and Barry Switzer and Hank Stram and these kind of legendary coaches, and they all were aware of the series and thought it was interesting. So they were happy to be on, and they were all great. And I enjoyed talking to each of them and getting some stories from them. And as we're first or second day of rehearsal, went over it again just to thank them after the rehearsal, and went into the green room, so as it was, and I just said it's really fun to have you guys here, and it's fun to see interacting with Craig, and they said, this is fun for us, we're enjoying it. So I started to leave, and Switzer asked me, he says, can I walk out with you? He says, I just got a question. And I said, what? And he said, and this apropos of what you're asking me, he said, so who is it on the show that knows so much about the life of a college football coach? And I said, well, really nobody. He says, no, but you created the show. And I said, yeah. I said, well, I guess. I said, haven't thought about it, but I said, maybe it's not so different, really. I said, I've got like 4 other, quote, producers on the show that report to me. I said, that's not totally different from a head coach who has assistant coaches under him. I said, I have a network that I report to, and a president of the studio that I report to, which is not unlike reporting, I guess, to a college president. And he goes, I guess that's right. He says, I guess that would. And I said, yeah. So I'm still sort of writing it from my experience, but I'm putting it in another package. And the fact that he totally bought that, and by the way, I don't think I'd ever thought of it until he asked me that. But I realized there was some similarity there, but it's not about me being on a team. That was just something that I thought of.
You mentioned, Barry, that your original idea was a person who's in a very competitive environment, and it could be anything. It could be TV, it could be advertising, any number of things. You wrote the screenplay for One Night, Two Teams, and I don't know if you remember the beginning, but in the beginning of that screenplay, it's Bear Bryant and John McKay. It's the night before the 1970 USC-Alabama game. They are at a cocktail party at a high-end alumni house in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
Correct.
And in this screenplay, you did not write Bear Bryant, 65, weather beaten, famous football coach at the University of Alabama, and John McKay, 55, dapper, famous football coach. No, what you wrote was something like both men are at the very top of their profession. You allowed who they are to develop through narrative, but you didn't say so at the beginning. Yeah, they could have been oil executives. They could have been anything. And so I noticed that right off the bat, where this is the connective tissue that you're talking about, football coaches, but you're seeing them as highly competitive people, or people in a very highly competitive environment. And certainly you have worked in a very highly competitive environment. I wonder if we could move on to Robin Williams and Patch Adams, because Robin, I know I met Robin Williams in high school, went to the same high school. I'll quickly tell the story. I was in a driver's education, and we're driving along on Paradise Drive in Marin County, which is a very nice area overlooking the bay. And all of a sudden there's a stretch limo that's completely blocking the ability to drive. So we're stuck there, and standing there is this dude in a tux, and he's leaning against the car, and all of a sudden the instructor goes, "Hey, Robin," and the instructor knew him because he'd gone to that high school.
Right.
We looked down, hey, that's Robin Williams. I don't think he was in Mork and Mindy yet, but he was well known in the circuits. So I just wanted to add that. But his performance in Patch Adams is, he has so much range. Wasn't this really the story about it's a true story about a depressed, suicidal man who becomes a doctor and realizes that bedside manner is just as important as how great a doctor you are. And it was as empathetic a movie as I've ever seen, and as good a performance by Robin as I've ever seen. And that includes Good Morning Vietnam and Good Will Hunting. I mean, he was at the top of his game.
Yeah.
Where did this come from?
This was brought to me, actually, by Mike Farrell and Marvin Minoff, who were partners. And they knew Patch Adams. And I had never heard of Patch Adams. And they asked me to read he had a book, which I did, which I found really interesting and fascinating. And so then they said, would you meet him? And I said, of course. And so we met, and he was as cool as he could be, and as cool as you would hope he would be. He was interested in the fact that they and we now wanted to do a movie about him. He was not, that I remember, pedantic in any way about it must be this or it must be that. But I was also assuring him that I said, I really want to get to the essence of what you do, because I said, I think it's not only completely unique, but I said, I think it's unheard of. And I think that people will be fascinated by your story. In the same way that people that you just come in contact with one-on-one become fascinated by your aura and the things that you can do. And so he seemed to be very comfortable with what we were talking about. And so now I have to, like I said, I have to say, I did not write the script to Patch Adams. I supervised the writing, but I did not write the script. And I think honestly, I only remember being on the set 2 days. And both of those were not to supervise anything. They were basically to just make an appearance because there was nothing really to supervise. Everything was going along very well. And I just wanted to say that I was really, happy with the dailies that I saw, and at any rate, and I wasn't necessarily happy with all of them, but I, like anybody, but I was really charmed by what he was doing. And that was about the extent of our relationship. We did, when the movie was finished, Universal was quite concerned about it, because it hadn't. They didn't like the edit. They didn't like the cut, basically, and so I understood why, because I didn't necessarily like it either. But I said, I think we can fix it, and we did some work on the edit with the editors. So the studio still did not believe in it, even after the changes we made. They had no confidence in it, and they said, we're going to test screen this, but they said we're going to sneak it. In other words, we're not going to announce it. We're just going to put it in a theater for a night. And they went to Scottsdale, Arizona. And they said, "Do you
the scene of the crime, Barry?"
They said, "Do you?" They said, "Do you?" Exactly, right back to where I met Jerry. And I said, "No, actually, I don't need to." I said, "I've been to Scottsdale." And I said, I'm interested in hearing how they take it and how they receive it. But I said, no, I don't necessarily need to be there. So I get a call early the next morning, like 8:00. And they said, have anybody called you? Have you heard anything? And I said, no. And they said, well, the audience survey, it kind of went through the roof. They said it was so successful, we don't trust it. So they said, we're going to do a second sneak preview in Henderson, Nevada tonight. Happens to be Glenn Les Charles' hometown. They said, do you want to be there for that? And I said, no. If it did well in Scottsdale, I said, I've had good luck in Scottsdale. Let me see what I can do in Henderson, Nevada. So I don't need to be there. So at any rate, they sneak it that night. They call me the next morning, and they had described it before the call. They had told me, they said, we're gonna sneak it in Henderson, Nevada tonight, and Monday morning at 8:00, we need you to be in a meeting because we're gonna do a postmortem. That was the quote. So they were anticipating a postmortem. So they were anticipating it was also going to tank in.
This sounds an awful lot like the way American Graffiti got received, and everyone loved it. The suits at Universal kept saying no, and everybody who saw it loved it. How about the American public, for God's sake?
Yeah. It is true. No, you're absolutely right.
That scene, Barry, I got to throw this in.
Sure.
When Patch welcomes the American Gynecological Association. That's one of the greatest scenes in the history of the film.
I thought the movie was wonderful. And any rate, but you asked about Robin. I mean, I had really very little to no association with Robin other than being on the set one day, meeting him at the reading. But that we had a director that we totally trusted, and Robin knows what he's doing. So there was no reason to physically be there all the time. But the last thing about this is that when they called me that morning, they remember I told you they said they were going to do a post-mortem on Monday morning. I get this call like at 8:00, and they said we're still having the meeting, but they said don't say anything negative. They said last night at Henderson, Nevada, it tested even higher than it did in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I said, really? They said, yeah. They said
very separate cities, right?
Yeah. They said it's just to tell you, they said it's the second highest testing movie in the history of Universal. And I said, really? And they said, yeah. So anyway, so the meeting today is going to be basically champagne, and everybody's going to toast to And I said, okay, so that's a complete change from what I thought we were going into, which was, how can we fix this? So, any rate, so I said, what? I'm just curious. I said, if it's the second highest testing movie, what's the highest testing movie in the history of? And they said, it was a movie with James Garner called Tank. And I said, really? That was the highest testing movie? Yeah. But it made me laugh when I thought, well, if Tank is your highest testing movie, then Patch Adams should be, right up there. So at any rate, it went from almost sounding like that was going to be unreleasable to it was released on Christmas Day. So that was a pretty big turnaround over a weekend.
There's some 6 degrees of separation going on here. First, you have Robin Williams and a few others, but you do a movie. Let me ask you, was one of your co-producers on Catch Me If You Can a guy named Gerald Molen?
It's very possible. I'm sorry.
Well, the reason I ask,
tend to be bad with names, but
you know who Gerald Molen is?
No, I know I've heard of the name, but I don't remember that we met.
Gerald Molen, there's some real serendipity going on here.
Oh yeah.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that he was on Catch Me If You Can. He was Spielberg's go-to guy. He produced Schindler's List, not bad.
No.
He produced Rain Man, and he has a role in Rain Man, and where he's one of the doctors at the hospital where Tom Cruise or Dustin Hoffman is being housed. The reason I bring this up is because the 1970 USC Alabama game.
Mm-hmm.
In 2004, before you came along, before Kerry McCluggage came along, Alan Graff, the guy I was mentioning earlier, who is a second unit director, he wrote a screenplay, and Gerald Molen bought that screenplay and was going to make a movie based on the 1970 USC Alabama football game. And I don't want to get into too much detail, but it was poisoned by one of Alan's teammates. And I'm not going to bring his name up because apparently he and Alan have made up. And in fact, they do Bible study every week. So Alan's forgiven him. But Gerald Molen, who, as I say, was a top-level producer, was going to do that. And that's the reason that project was still there for the taking. And I wrote my book. And so I'd like you to talk about, did Kerry McCluggage call you? How did you find out about it? Because this is all 2006, 2007. It was a big moment in my life. And I have to say, I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I have to say, because you're talking about your screenwriting career, your writing career, and you've obviously have an exceptional talent. If you somehow saw something in what I wrote, that's a nice compliment for me.
Well,
but get to what happened here, and how did it? Who called who?
So Kerry gave me your book, and another one, which was not as good as yours. Anyway, I read the book, and for me, it was a page turner. That I was just so interested in how the game came about and who those two guys were. And when somebody hands me a script, I'll read it the first night. Hand me a book, and it may take me a few weeks because that's generally not what I do. This one I just went right through. And so I called Kerry and I said, well, I read it. I love it. I said, I think this is a great idea. And I said, the only thing I think is, we have to figure out, we got to find somebody to write it. And Kerry said, well, I thought it would be you. And I said, oh, well, I wasn't reading it with that in mind. I said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, I do love it. I said, let me let me try. I won't give anything to you. Let me write 10 or 20 pages if I can, and I'll be honest with you and tell you, if I like it or if I don't like it, if I don't like what I'm doing. But I said but I can't really tell you. I'll just say, let me try. Let me just try it. Let's not do anything beyond that and see what happens. So I did. I wrote, I think it was about 16 or 18 pages, and I called him and I said, well, I'm liking it. And I said, I don't know if anybody else will, but I said, I'm liking it and I want to finish. So I said, give me a chance to finish it. And that is how I ended up writing it. That's how I ended up finishing it. And I thought the story between those two was so riveting and so human, especially with both of them being, at least from a media standpoint, larger than life characters. But they understood their stature, and they could relate to it with each other, because not very many other people could relate to what they were going through, because they were both of them at the top of their game. Yeah. And I got really fascinated when I learned that ABC was going to televise the game. And then when they heard that they were afraid, they canceled televising it live because they were afraid that there might be riots. And they didn't want to televise that basically in the holiday season. And that's not what the idea was. And so they canceled the telecast. Well, that really intrigued me. I thought that's interesting, because it's now nobody's really seen much from that game. So, and yet it was all true. So, at any rate, I just I loved that script. Of all the things I've done, that is actually that's been my favorite project, and it's not unusual. It's not surprising that it's the one that hasn't been done, hasn't been greenlit. And I can't tell you how. Well, Harry, I'm sure, has probably shared with you, but I can't tell you how many times we've heard somebody sit there and say, "We love this. We're going to make this."
Warner's twice.
Yeah.
Disney, Universal. God, we had Carl Weathers. We've had, I remember, Jeff Daniels. But let me ask you this.
Yeah.
First of all, I saw it right from the beginning as two good old boys being very strange Moseses of progressivism or civil rights. Two guys you wouldn't think. A guy from West Virginia, a guy from Arkansas and Alabama, and yet they, from a very different time in American history, and yet they come together through a combination of convenience and profession and some moral desire to do something, and they're not even sure exactly what they're going to accomplish, and we don't find out till later. But I wonder this: if you were thinking about actors when you wrote that, at least the original screenplay, did you have anybody in mind?
Well, I've gone through several different people. I think initially, and this probably comes just from the fact that I've worked with him, but because of his physical stature and because of Bear's physical stature, the first person I thought of was Craig T. Nelson.
At that time, sure.
Craig, to my knowledge, I don't think has ever read the script, and I wouldn't want to mention it to him with not knowing whether the show, whether it was set up and whether people were also good with that. But I liked his stature. I liked his walk. I thought there was a lot of things about him that embodied Bear. Mm-hmm. And my first instinct for McKay was Richard Dreyfuss.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I just liked his stature and opposite Craig's, which was, to me, that was McKay opposite Bear. So physically, those were the guys that I thought of, and McKay, to me, doesn't. I don't know if there is such a thing as what a look of a football coach, but he had a, I don't know, he had a sense of humor. He wasn't what you think typically as a as a football coach, and you wouldn't necessarily have thought of those two guys as being the friends that they were. So I thought there was a lot of, and I wanted that same relationship between the two actors. But that is my one favorite pet project that we haven't been able to get going.
I mean, I would not have thought about Richard Dreyfuss, but he's such a great actor.
Yeah.
I think he could have pulled it off. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but I knew J.K. McKay very well, and I introduced him to Carrie, and I don't know whether you met him. You probably
Yes.
And I don't remember if you recall this, but McKay was an attorney. I think he had an office in Century City, and I believe his on the same hall as where his office was, or in the same building, was one of the major talent agencies, and Kevin Costner was a client, and Kevin Costner would occasionally be in that building, and McKay and Costner got to know each other that way. And at one point, I'm told that McKay said, "Hey, we're doing a movie about my dad. How'd you like to play him?" And Costner wanted to do it. I don't know whether you ever heard that or not.
I heard something. Yeah, I heard a version of that. I hadn't heard that, but yeah, I know that Costner had been suggested. Which, by the way, I'm a big Costner fan. I certainly would not have put up any objection to that, but.
Right. Well, Harper, we've been leaving you out of the conversation, but there's a reason for it. We're getting into things that are very personal to me, but I'm sure you've got some more questions for Barry before we wrap everything up.
Very well, of course, yes. And being respectful of your time, just want to, what excites you now? What are things that really get you going? You're talking about the project here, and you have pet ones that may have not been done, but what are some of the things that keep you going? And is there a young protege or someone that you can say is like you or comes from that same type of background where they're new in the business, they need a break, they're talented, but they just need a chance and an opportunity to get to show what they can do?
I think I have done that some in the past. I don't do it so much now, largely because I'm living away from the industry. We live in Montecito because it's not Hollywood. It's very tranquil here, and I haven't really. I've been approached a few times. But not to necessarily mentor, but to share, not unlike the things we're talking about here, whether that be a class or whatever. But no, and I wouldn't be opposed to doing it, but there isn't anybody necessarily that I'm saying I'd like to take you under my wing and show you the ropes, because it's also been, it's been over 10 years since I did a series, and things do change. And so that it's not really part of what I do. I will tell you one very short, quick anecdote. A couple of years ago, they have a Santa Barbara Film Festival here every year. And the subject is different. And in this particular year, and again, this was 4 or 5 years ago, comedy was what they were focusing on, and part of what they do at the film festival is they get a writer, producer, somebody to do a class based on whatever the movie that they're screening was about, and so they do a class with mostly basically high school students, and the high school students have some mentors too. So they said, do you think it's possible to teach comedy? And I said, no, I don't think so. And I said, really? I said, no. I said, not necessarily. I said, I mean, you can help shape it. But I said, I don't think that you can take a person who doesn't have an inherent sense of humor and teach them how to have a sense of humor or how to look at the world in a different way than they naturally do. So I said, I don't think that you can teach it, but you might be able to, people might be able to have it in their genes and not know it. I said, but they said, would you be willing at least to just do one class? And I said, yes, I'll do that. So, and I'm not a teacher. So I said, I have no idea what I'm doing. But what I decided to do is I took five different punchlines from things that I had written. And by themselves, not one of them is a joke. So before the kids came in, and they weren't all young kids, some of them were older too, but I wrote these five on the board. And so when they came in, I gave a brief talk just about some of the things like that we're talking about now. And I said, they were supposed to have an assignment. And I said, well, first of all, before we get into the assignment, I said, how many people here, and be honest, raise your hand, how many people here were nervous when they heard that this was going to be a class about comedy? And I only saw one student raise their hand, but all of the adults who were there as their supervisors raised their hands, which made everybody laugh. And I said, now there's a good example of the unexpected making you laugh. But I said, this young woman here in the front row, she happened to be Asian. I said, now you're the only one who raised your hand that you were nervous about because it was comedy. And I said, why were you nervous? And she said, because I'm not funny. And I said, well, is anybody in your family funny? And she said, no, my parents are both professors. And everybody laughed. And she looked surprised. And I said, see, you didn't know that was funny, but I said it is, because when you said, I don't come from a funny family, and then you said your parents are professors, that gave us so much information about how they're perceived and how you perceive them. And I said, and everybody laughed. And she was just shocked. So anyway, and the assignment I've always remembered that as saying, can somebody be funny? They can, if they may not know it, but there may be a comic gene in them that they're not developing. But what was the other part of that was actually interesting was that we split up, or had them split up into 5 different groups, and they had an hour to collectively build a story. They could pick any one of the 5 punchlines because none of them were funny by themselves. You could pitch any of the 5 punchlines, and they had to build a story that paid off with that punchline. So they all went out. The adults were nervous. The kids were all kind of excited. They were there over their lunch hour, so it took them about an hour. They came back in, and then each group had a spokesperson, and they would get up and they would start telling the story that the group had come up with. And everybody in the room was watching the board, trying to figure out where's this going, because the stories never seemed like there's a play. How do any of these things attach to that? And invariably, every single one surprised the room when they heard it because they didn't see it coming. And I said, that's the last thing I can leave you with. I said, there is an absolute concrete build to a joke, but that you shouldn't see it coming if you don't know how it's coming. And part of the laughter is the surprise of it. And I said, if you see it ahead of time, it's not very funny. But if you can't see it until you see it, you go, how did they come up with that? And so a lot of times this is how it's done. So anyway, for what it's worth.
Barry, that's interesting. I remember at the beginning of our interview with you, and we're going to wrap up here. I wanted to ask you. You made a comment earlier about you would write all the time. You write every day. You had the passion for it. Do you still write today? And if so, what are some of the topics that you like to discuss? And if there's anything of interest that is keeping you running right now?
First of all, no, I do not write every day. Whatever that thing is inside you that itches, that makes you get up and write every day, doesn't itch anymore. So I don't write every day. I still will find things that I'm interested in, but the story that we were talking about that Steve's book is based on, that if I have a passion left in me, it's that story. I would like to see that made. It's personally, I think it's the best piece of work I've ever done. And part of it because it's a true story. Part of it is because some of when I met with JK and I wanted to see how, and Sam too before he passed away, but I asked him if there was anything in there that bothered him, that didn't seem true to life or whatever, and he said no. He says nothing. He says, I mean, we loved it. And I said, well, okay, then I've got to ask you, because I said there's one scene in there that is a complete fabrication, and I said I really tried not to do any of these that I didn't think was exactly sort of the way it happened, even if I wasn't in the room. But I said there's one thing in the movie that never happened, and that's when you guys come up to the party that I've got McKay and his wife at, and I said, you come up, and John's been in there regaling guys with his stories, and they said your son's here and they want to talk to you, and Pat. And you go out to talk to them, and they said, we just wanted to tell you that we've come to a decision about where we want to go, because McKay obviously wanted them to come to USC, and Stanford was after them because they really wanted Hayden because he was smart. He was like a straight A student. So I had them come up to the party and wanted to meet or call out John. So John comes out to see them, and he sees the two of them standing there. And they said, we just wanted to come tell you that we've talked a lot about it, thought a lot about it, and we've come to a decision about where we want to go to school. And John, feeling they came here for protection because they've chosen the place he didn't want them to go, and he's not going to make a scene in front of everybody. And so he's prepared to hear that they're going to wherever, Stanford, whatever it was now. And they said, we thought about it, we're going to USC, and it totally takes McKay off guard. And his wife comes in at that point, and he says the kids are going to USC, and she gets emotional about it. She hugs them both, and they go back in to tell the whole party that's going on that they're coming to USC, of which everybody's obviously a USC fan. So the party erupts, and there's glad handing all around. And I said, so it doesn't bother you? And J.K. says, I love that scene. He says, it was great. And I said, but it wasn't true. It didn't happen. He says, no, but he says, Sam and I talked, that's what we should have done. I said, well, if you're okay with it, then I'm okay with it.
Said about it. He goes,
what's that?
McKay always said, he said, one's living in my guest room and I'm sleeping with the other's mother.
Yes, that's right.
Right. It occurs to me, a guy who could have played John McKay, and of course we would have had to make this movie 30 years earlier, and that was Bob Newhart could have played John McKay. He had that droll sense of humor, and you said Newhart, you could write McKay.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. I'm trying to imagine what Bob would say, because if he how comfortable he would be about being in a quote a drama. But that's interesting. That is a really interesting thought, which unfortunately he's not with us now either. So.
I interviewed him one time. It may have been the last interview he ever conducted. I got him by phone in 2000, I believe, when I wrote for a magazine. He was hilarious.
Oh yeah.
But he was serious. He didn't realize, he didn't try to be funny. That wasn't what he was trying to do.
Oh, he
was actually being cutting, but there was just a little edge to it that was just funny. And it wasn't something he was trying to do, but
he never was. No, there was never any seeming effort behind it.
You know who else could be funny? I don't know if you knew Rich McKay, the other son. I interviewed him. He was a couple years younger than Hayden and John K. McKay. He was, in fact, Harper, you must have known Rich McKay. Was he the general manager of the Falcons when you played for them?
No, while I was playing, he wasn't. But I visited with Rich, and I talked to him a little bit about his father and that game in specifics. And so there's a little bit of a connection there. But Rich obviously built the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. He was responsible for all of that under Arthur's supervision. So he's been a very, very busy man in the Atlanta Falcon history, obviously, in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I found him to be a little more similar to his father in terms of the comic timing.
Yeah. John he was pretty funny. He was really.
Yeah, he was. I mean, we had Bill Dwyer on a few weeks back. He was a former editor of the LA Times, and he was talking about being indoctrinated into the Los Angeles sporting scene. And he said nothing indoctrinated him more than going to Julie's Barrel, Trojan Barrel, which there were some scenes at Julie's Trojan Barrel in your screenplay where McKay would hold court after practices and sometimes games across the street from the Coliseum. And Dwyer is a Notre Dame guy. So, he was on the receiving end of a lot of bards, but it was all in good fun.
Well, it interests me. I mean, I love hearing. I love watching. I like watching true stories. I used to say I write fiction, but I like to watch reality. But
it's funny, Barry, that someone said, or that the ABC didn't want to televise it because of the possibility of riots. And it was touch and go because there were USC players who brought guns, Tony Smith in particular, maybe one or two others. But what actually happened at the end of the game was black people from the neighborhood showing up at the bus with candles, singing hymns. And so I really saw it as a Christian story, as a spiritual story.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote it. I wrote it to have movie moments. I don't know if I saw it as a movie. I know early on, Ron Howard expressed interest, David L. Wolper. There was a lot of stuff going on during that time, even while I was writing it. So I remember thinking about, am I going to write this, like do you write a book like a screenplay? And I had written screenplays, so I guess I kind of thought like that, but I just wanted that fast-paced action that would have that opportunities for, as you say, movie moments, and it was certainly there.
Well, I would sure like to see it made.
Yeah, so would I. So would my
It's a great story.
Yeah, and there are obviously other stories as well that you have participated in and would like to see become production finals, right? They're in the can because they've been done. We want to say thank you for your time, Barry. I want to be respectful of it.
Thank you very much.
Kemp, young man from Hannibal, Missouri, and grows up to become a true icon in Hollywood tradition. So many different movies and TV shows. Catch Me If You Can, Patch Adams. We didn't even talk about Romeo and Michelle's high school reunion. Obviously, Coach, Taxi, relationships with different studios, Paramount, etc., and different networks. Barry, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it and are grateful for you being on with Take 5.
This is my pleasure. I've enjoyed this with you guys.
Well, thank you very much. And for Steven, Steven Travers, obviously, Harper LeBel, thank you for being a part of 100 Yards of Football and the show Take 5 with Steven Travers, where we get a chance to look at some of the intricacies of the business and also the imagery of both professional and collegiate sports. And today we had a great visit with Barry Kemp. We want to thank him for his time. We want to thank you for yours as well. We appreciate you being a part of the show, everybody. We want to say thank you.